Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to look at the power of intention. You might say this is part 3 of our prior series on the healing intention, but it's really going to be a self-contained interview on the power of intention, and my guest once again is Stephan Schwartz, who is one of the founders of the International Society for the Study of Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine, one of the founders of the International Remote Viewing Association, and one of the founders of the Society for the Anthropology of Consciousness, which is part of the American Anthropological Association. Stephan is also a columnist for Explore, the Journal of Science and Healing, and the former editor of Subtle Energies. He's the author of many books, including The 8 Laws of Change, Opening to the Infinite, The Alexandria Project, and The Secret Vaults of Time. Welcome once again, Stephan. I know we're getting now very close to a subject dear to your heart and dear to my heart, and a very important subject, I think, for our viewers as well, which is the nature and the power of human intentionality. It's probably the greatest gift that any one of us has, is that we can intend, and we can be responsible for what we intend with our mind.
I think you're absolutely correct. I've said this before, and I've said it in the course of these interviews. There is, as far as I can see, there is no greater power than the collective intention of a large group of people. It can change politics. It can change physical reality. It can affect healing. I mean, it all stems from this idea: consciousness is the fundamental that we're dealing with. Once you begin to see the world in that way, that it isn't that your body generates consciousness, it's that your consciousness generates your body in a way, and that you have the power through your intention to literally alter the circumstances of your physical surroundings, which seems very strange, but which nonetheless is demonstrated again and again in the experimental literature. If you, for instance, I mean, we've discussed in other sessions the idea of therapeutic intention, that is, the consciousness of an individual having an effect on the well-being of another organism, for good or ill. And we can extrapolate that out now, I think, and say, well, let's start with another version of it. Let's take placebo effect, for instance.
Very good one.
My personal view in terms of healing is that what's really going on is not that the people are sending energy, but that there is a linkage that occurs between the healer and the recipient, and that linkage stimulates within the recipient the power to literally alter their own organism. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, if you look at placebo, which is one of the most extraordinary experimental bodies of data, it normally gets dismissed. The placebo study would be typically, and by the way, this was invented by Benjamin Franklin, who invented the whole idea of placebo, at least in a scientific context, and it's certainly older than that for shamanic reasons. But the idea that you literally have through the consciousness of your mind, you have the ability to change your physical well-being. Now, if we look at this placebo literature, we see that across thousands of studies, that people who get the sugar pill, as it were, now a placebo study, for those who may not be familiar with it, is a protocol approach in an experiment in which half of the people get the medicine or the treatment of whatever it is, and there's even surgical placebos, and the other people don't get a treatment. They may get a mimic of the treatment. And yet we know across all of these studies over many decades that between 35 and 40% of the people who get the sugar pill will have results that are as good or better than the people who get the treatment.
It's one of the strongest effects in medicine, I believe.
Absolutely. Absolutely one of the strong. In fact, Irving Kirsch, a researcher who's been particularly focused on placebo, has shown that you can have successful results in a medical study when you just use placebo. So if 35 to 40% get a result that's as good or better than the people who get the sugar pill,
you mean the regular?
That get the treatment.
Yes.
The sugar pill people, 35 to 40% do as well or better than the people who get the medical treatment, whatever it is. Well, if you think about that for a second, suppose we were doing a pancreas study. Well, we know from other studies that most people have no idea where their pancreas is in their body, and even less idea about what it does. And yet, in a typical study of this nature, if I gave you the treatment and I took the sugar pill, even though, let's, for the example, say neither one of us know anything about the pancreas, I would still 35 to 40% of the would get a result as good as you got with the medication. Now, the first question to ask is, how do you know what to do? I mean, when people get a 35 to 40% get a result that's as good or better than the treated people, how do they know?
Well, intention, as I understand it, is goal-oriented.
Yes, but how do they know? How do you know which cells in your body you have to manipulate in order to get that effect? How do you do that? Yeah. Well, the evidence suggests to us that there is a linkage that occurs between the physicians, the administering person, and the recipient. But because where do they acquire the knowledge?
You're saying they are acquiring it from the physician?
I'm saying that actually what I'm saying is that we, because of this non-local aspect of our consciousness, that we can access the information which tells us which part of our body we need to turn off or turn on or stimulate in order to produce that effect.
I see. Now, I recall Andrea Puharich, who we referred to earlier, a medical doctor who did some early studies in healing. He coined a term, he called it energy, by which he meant intelligent energy. It's as if the process has an intelligence of its own.
Yes, and Andre, what he was struggling with, because he was still thinking in terms of energy, was he had to confront, because he was a good researcher, he had to confront the concept that there was some kind of guiding intelligence.
Yes.
So when for instance, there are surgical placebo studies. You can't do them anymore. The human experimentation committees won't let you do it. But there were earlier studies that were done where, for instance, people would get the surgery, but some would get the real surgery and some would simply get the incision, but the actual, and yet still you had placebo effect. So what this is telling us, I would propose, is I think of it in terms of psychophysical self-regulation. That we are able to access an informational aspect of ourselves, that non-local consciousness part, and that through that we know which part of our bodies have to be altered in order to produce the placebo effect. Now, people rarely think about this. In fact, they rarely talk about placebos at all. They talk about the drugs. But when you actually look at the studies, you see, as you say, placebo is a very powerful effect, and that somehow people know what to do.
Because even though the sugar pill has no real medicinal value whatsoever, they have, by virtue of taking it, they are intending that they are going to be healed.
Exactly. That is precisely it. But not just that they intend to be healed, but they get access to the informational construct which will allow a very particular kind of healing to take place. And so, again, what this is all suggesting, when you look at all of this sort of material, and you have to look across many different disciplines and really look at large bodies of data. What you come away with is not only that we have the power to control ourselves down to the cellular level and to have an effect on other beings down to the cellular level, which is what the healing studies are about, but that we also have access to information which allows us to know how to make that happen.
I would even propose, Stephen, that it's a little bit beyond information. Theodore Roszak once wrote a book, The Cult of Information. I interviewed him about it years ago, and he would distinguish between information, knowledge, and wisdom. And I think we're getting into the realm of wisdom here.
Well, selective understanding of information, yes, I would agree. And yet, we know, for instance, that children have placebo effects. Now, how does a child know this? And again, I think we confront this business that we are first and foremost beings of consciousness. And that the physical manifestation is a manifestation of consciousness. If you look at the reincarnation studies, for instance, that were done by Ian Stevenson are now being done by Jim Tucker, these things where people seem to bring across scar tissue and birthmarks from earlier incarnations, how do they know? Where is that information? In fact, I would propose to you that the great mystery, for me anyway, the great question is, what is information? Because it's not in a physical place. If you are talking about reincarnation, information coming across between manifestations of a consciousness in an incarnation, where was that information? When we talk to people who've had near-death experiences and they produce objectively verifiable information during states of brain death or non-function, where is that information?
Well, I think that mysterious question is what prompted some thinkers, such as your colleague, Irvin Laszlo, to postulate the Akashic field, that we are embedded in a field that includes all information and all wisdom even.
Yes, it doesn't begin with, it's not just with Irving. This has been, Empedocles says God is a circle that has no center and no dimension. So what we're dealing with, I think over and over, we keep rediscovering it, but it gets a little bit here and a little bit there, and it's, people rarely sort of take an overview of it, is that information is, and its use is in fact the great mystery, because when you deal with, for instance, with survival communication like mediumship, where is that information? It's not incarnate, so where is it?
Well, another answer might be that of the great philosopher Bishop George Berkeley, who basically said, and it's an irrefutable argument, ironically, that everything exists within the mind of God. Yes,
and so we think of God in religious terms, but if we begin to think of it instead as a great unity of consciousness, and that religion is a manifestation of particular cultures and particular individuals' understanding of that great unity, and you look across all the world's religions, what you see is that they're basically all saying the same thing. There is some kind of great meta-unity, that the all, and that it gets interpreted in accordance with an individual experience and the cultural context in which that individual lives, but that the fundamental of it, this idea of the universality, and that leads to things like the Akashic Record. That led to Adolf Bastian, his idea of the elemental thoughts of humanity. That leads to Carl Jung, who is a student of Bastian's, coming up with the idea of the collective unconscious. And that leads to Joseph Campbell's idea of the monomyth. And then we look at things like archetypes, or the hero of 1,000 faces that Campbell talked about. Why is it that these recurrent themes, what are people tapping into?
Well, let me add one more. Joseph Campbell worked extensively with one of my mentors, Gene Houston, who developed the notion that since we are embedded in what we could call the mind of God, for lack of a better term, or spirit, or the
whatever,
she'd like to say we are like godlings. We are little baby gods. We're beginning to acquire some of powers that might be considered in a more magnified form to be godlike.
Well, I think we can. I like to get things out of religious frameworks, because when you get into religious frameworks, you get into a sectarian and denominational arguments and dogmas, and so I want to step back from that.
I totally agree, but I'm not familiar with any religion that refers to godlings.
No, well, if you look at 19th century theosophy, for instance, they move into godlings a little bit.
Yeah, esoteric traditions too.
I mean, esoteric traditions have this idea, but if you get underneath the cultural affect part, and what they're all trying to say is that within this great unity, somehow we are some subset of that, whether you call it godlings or anything else, but we are all operating within this matrix of consciousness.
Yes,
and that within this matrix of consciousness, we can operate both in the space-time level, that is, we can do things at the physical level, but we can also operate at the consciousness level. And once you see that part of it, then you can understand, for instance, let's take Roger Nelson's Global Consciousness Project.
Very important.
I think a very important project.
Yeah.
Roger was the lab manager at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Group for many years, and that one of their special areas of interest was, can consciousness affect the performance of various kinds of systems like random number generators, or they had a huge pachinko machine that was on the wall in the lab to make the little balls that come down fall in different and non-random orders, that kind of thing. So for years they were doing studies with single individuals. Roger asked, I think it's an act of brilliance, he asked the bigger question. If it works at the individual level, does it work at the social level? And in order to test that hypothesis, he put random numbers out all over the planet. He called them eggs. And they ran 24/7. And they were supposed to be random. I mean, these things are designed to be random. That's why they're called random number generators.
And he was able to monitor them all simultaneously.
Yes, and he had them all linked together in a network. And so he's got these things running 24/7 all over around the world. And his question was, when there is a coalescing of consciousness, some kind of an event which focuses the attention of everybody, or large numbers, not everybody, but large numbers of people, particularly if it has an emotional quality to it. The death of Princess Diana, the Nelson Mandela's funeral, the tsunami in Japan,
opening ceremony of the Olympics.
Opening ceremony of the Olympics, exactly. Where you have a significant number of people around the world, all of whom for a period of time become very intensely focused on something.
They're all looking at their TV sets at the same moment.
Or listening to the radio or whatever. Would that have any effect, as in the laboratory where a single individual is trying to affect a single...
And he's measuring quantum mechanical fluctuations.
Yes.
As if when these eggs are spread around the globe, he's looking at what you might think of as the quantum foam that underlies reality.
Quantum foam. Yeah, that's a good one. Yes. But what he finds... I mean,
or the Heisenberg or Schrodinger probability clouds.
Whatever. That's an... Oh, yes, I like that. That was a very good one. But in any case, what Roger finds, and he's been doing this now for years, So the odds of this occurring by chance are, must be at this point something like 1 in a trillion, where 1 in 20 would be significant. What he's finding is that when this coalescing of consciousness occurs, that these random number generators produce non-random performance.
Yes.
And so what that's telling us, I think, is that not only is all consciousness interlinked and interdependent, but that when it comes together in focused attention, it produces effects that literally alter the structure of reality.
Yes.
And so what we're saying here is not only can you have an effect at the physical level, but you can have an effect at the level of consciousness, and that this effect of consciousness, we know, for instance, that it is possible through healing, through therapeutic intention, for healers to alter the DNA. They alter the telomeres, the little things, telomeres, the little fundamental structures of DNA. Mm-hmm. So a healer can literally alter your DNA.
You're talking about the sequence.
Yeah, you can literally alter the DNA.
Yes.
So this goes from basically the most fundamental aspects of life all the way up to the performance of high-order mammals. Then we begin to look at, if we look at the geomagnetic field, a subject most people don't even think about, and we discover that when there are fluctuations in the Earth's geomagnetic field, that has a performance on everything from the way cows line up in a field, to the way butterflies migrate, to the way fish swim. Mm-hmm. So that we are beginning to see, and I think we stand at the verge of a new, I hate to use a new paradigm, that's a term coined by Thomas Kuhn to mean a worldview in which large numbers of people agree this is the right view. Yeah. But I think we are now standing at a threshold of a new worldview in which we see consciousness not only as a fundamental of science, but a fundamental of reality, and that
you're looking at the ecology of consciousness.
Yes, exactly. Oh, that's very good. I like that one.
Yeah, I wrote a paper by that title back in about 1970.
Well, there you go. Well, I haven't read it, but that's actually the ecology of consciousness is actually a very good idea.
Yeah, and it dealt with geomagnetic fluctuations and the like.
What we're seeing is that we have an interaction not only at the physical level, but at this informational level.
Yes.
And that it is therefore possible to, by joining together and holding common intention of well-being, for instance, that we can literally change the structure of reality.
And right now there are some specific areas that would benefit from some change.
Absolutely. Well,
in the social, political, ecological sphere, we could come up with a long list.
I mean, I would say that we are not going to understand how to deal with climate change remediation until we understand that we are in this matrix of consciousness and that all life and all consciousness is interconnected and interdependent. Because it's only until you understand that you can design solutions that will produce the kind of remediation we're going to need. You can't get at it just from a mechanistic point of view. You have to change your worldview. And we are awakening to a completely different perspective of reality, I believe, that in just literally another generation or two, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental of science and that working with consciousness is one of the ways that we can achieve not only individual well-being, but social well-being. And in that lies a pathway to our not only well-being and survival, prosperity, all of those words, but that it will give us an insight into who we are and why we're here.
Very profound thoughts, Stephan. Thank you so much for sharing them with me.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us.